This morning, we're going to begin a new focus on how our faith is lived out in our everyday lives. Our scripture this morning is from Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 through 14. Colossians 3, 12 through 14. And it says, "Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity." We know that Jesus has condensed all of the commands in Scripture down to one. We've talked about it a lot, right? Down to one, and that is love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. And he said that the second one, if there's a second one, is this: love your neighbor as yourself. In Colossians, in this chapter, in this passage, we're reminded that our ability to love God and our ability to love others comes from our position in the universe. You are God's chosen people. You are holy and dearly loved. And that's how we can then turn and love each other. That's how we can walk in kindness. That's how we can walk in gentleness with each other. Is from that firm foundation of knowing beyond a shadow of a doubt, I am God's chosen people. I am God's child, holy and dearly loved. When we stand on that firm foundation, then we're not shaken by unkindness when it comes our way. We're not shaken when it comes time to ask for forgiveness or to offer forgiveness. We're able to walk in gentleness, in humility, in patience with each other. Jesus told his disciples that people would know who their rabbi was, who they called master, by their love for one another. It's so much part of our identity that when the world looks at Christians, if we want them to see that we follow Jesus, then our actions, our lives have to be characterized by love. I think it's safe to assume that people will either be interested in our faith based on how well we love those who are part of our church family. But I think it's also safe to say that they will be interested in our faith based on how well we love those who are not part of our church family, not part of our family groups, how well we love people who are different from us. In the next few weeks, we're going to be looking at different ways that we can live out our faith step by step in our daily lives and how we can make a difference in the world that we live. So in 2006, the American Psychological Association presented a workshop to the UN on what they consider to be a vital topic. They said this is so important. And they pointed to its essential nature in maintaining relationships on a personal level, and on maintaining relationships on a community level, and even on an international level. It was a topic that they said would do all kinds of things for individuals and families, including these. They said this will improve physical and mental health. This will restore an oppressed person or a victim's sense of personal power. This will help to bring about reconciliation And this will promote hope for the resolution of real-world intergroup conflicts. Anybody have a guess as to what it was that they gave a workshop on? Forgiveness. Forgiveness. This is the topic we're diving into this morning. We're talking about this amazing, vital element to building and maintaining any relationship. Forgiveness is the key. This world needs forgiveness. Our marriages need forgiveness. Our families need forgiveness. And guess what? As Christians, we have an entire faith system that's built on what? Forgiveness. Here is the world crying out and saying, this is what we need. And guess what? We have it. Forgiveness and grace is the very foundation of everything that we say we believe. What a difference could we make in our worlds if we embrace this teaching of Christ and put it into practice and model it for our communities? What if we did forgiveness well? What if we did it really well? How would that change the divorce rate in Christian families? How would that change our ability to reach out and love people who are different from us? How would it change the way that we walk into our workplace, through our neighborhood? How would it change our world? But we don't always get it right, do we? Okay, I don't always get it right. I don't know about you. You probably get it right every time. So if this is just for me this morning, that's all right. I need the reminder. I don't always get it right. I can tell you I love being forgiven. I love being forgiven because I love that sense that my relationships are at peace. I don't always like to admit that I need forgiveness, though. Probably alone in that, too. I don't always like to say, I'm sorry. I don't always like to name the thing that I did that requires forgiveness. I don't always get it right. Not always good at walking through that reconciliation process. And I have a tiny suspicion that maybe I'm not alone. Just a tiny suspicion. But besides all of that, why should we as Christians care about forgiveness? Why should we as Christians care about forgiveness? Because forgiveness isn't just something that we should care about because it will help us to reach out and fill our pews. Forgiveness isn't just something we should care about because the American Psychological Association says that it's important. It's not just something we should care about because the world is calling for it. We as Christians have to set our agenda and our priorities by what? By what Christ commanded. Because if we are to be little Christs, Christians, followers of Jesus, we have to base our lives on what he taught. We know we're commanded to forgive by Jesus. Jesus said, in fact, if you're offering your gift at the altar and you remember that someone out there has something against you, you should stop what you're doing. You should go make amends and then come back and offer your gift. He also said that if we stand up to pray and we remember that we have something against someone else, that we need to forgive them. In fact, he says we should forgive them or else we won't be forgiven. That's pretty big there, Jesus. I have to forgive the grudges I'm holding, or you won't forgive me? But he says it not only there, he says it in the Matthew version of the Lord's Prayer. He says, if we don't forgive, our Father won't forgive us. And if we need a really good reason to forgive, let's remember that Christ, as he was hanging on the cross, prayed to his Father to forgive the men who put nails through his flesh. Puts forgiveness in perspective for us. I've never been nailed to a cross. Anybody? Okay. All right, I was going to say, if you have, come see me after and we will pray. We'll get you some counseling. I've never been nailed to a cross, but I still have times in my life where it's hard to forgive. As Christians, we're called to forgive because God has forgiven us. Not of just one thing, or 2 things, or 10 things. We're called to forgive because God has poured out his grace on us without measure. So what does it look like to forgive? What does it look like when we do this well? So again, I'm going to talk about personal experience because it probably just applies to me and not to you. But when I was growing up, I have an older sister and a younger brother, and sometimes we would argue. I know that doesn't apply to you. Sometimes we would argue, and my mom would make us stop. And she would make us do this thing where she would say, apologize to your brother. And it went something like this. I'm sorry. And she would say, okay, now you need to forgive your sister. You're forgiven. And while we didn't always get it right as children, and I know that that probably surprises you, that as a child I had trouble with forgiveness with my siblings. A lot of us enter life and adulthood and our own families equipped with not much more than that. We know we should apologize. We know we should forgive, but sometimes we just don't know how. Or we don't know how to do it effectively. Well, there's hope because there's people who study these things. There's a whole system of study on apologizing, which I think is really interesting to me, that there are people who chose this as their field of study. Aaron Lazare gives a whole system of apologizing, and it includes like 4 things that an apology must include and 3 things that it needs to do for the person being apologized to. Well, Christine Carter, she condenses it down to 3 parts that I thought would be easier to remember. So we're going to talk about what she says. She says an apology needs to go like this. You need to tell the other person how you feel. I am so sorry that I hurt you. I'm really sad that the words that I used were offensive. You need to admit your mistake and the negative impact that it had. I recognize that what I said was wrong. And I know that it hurt your feelings. I know that it offended you. And then you need to make it right. What can I do? What can I do to make it better? Now, I don't know about you, but it's hard to do those things. I mean, it seems really simple. Tell them how you feel, recognize your mistake, ask how you can make amends. Seems really simple, but boy, when you're in the middle of it, that's hard. That's really hard. When we apologize, we need to take full responsibility for for what we've done, but oftentimes we end up blaming the person that we're apologizing to. Have you ever heard apologies that go like this? Well, I'm sorry that you were hurt by that. Well, I'm sorry that you were offended by that. I'm sorry that you were hurt. Well, that's a whole lot different than saying, I'm so sorry that I hurt you. Because one takes the blame and throws it way out there. I'm not taking any blame. And the other one says, I take responsibility. Sometimes our apologies can sound like this. Well, I didn't mean to hurt you. You know, if I hit you with my car and it was an accident, that wouldn't make the damage any less real if it was an accident, right? When we hurt people, we need to take responsibility for the pain that we've caused, even if it was unintentional. You can say, it was never my intention to hurt you, but I recognize that I did. Do our apologies ever sound like this? Well, I hope you can get over it. Sometimes, right? Sometimes those are the words that come out of our mouths when what we really mean is, what can I do to make it better? If we can take responsibility for our mistakes, you know what? It gives freedom to other people to do the same. Have you ever seen a conversation go down like this? Well, it's not my fault. Well, it's not my fault either. Do you know that when you say, I blew it. I blew it. I said the wrong thing, and I know that I hurt you. When you say that to another person, it gives them the ability to back down their defenses and say, you know what? I could have said things better too. I could have done things better too. When we take responsibility for our mistakes, it gives freedom for the other person to do the same. Otherwise, it's a buildup of loggerheads until no one's to blame and everyone's at fault. And there's no solution. When we practice good apologizing at home, it sets a pattern and an example for future disagreements. If you don't admit fault, if you don't ever take responsibility, eventually people shut down. But when we begin to take responsibility, we not only set a good example for our kids, we not only set a good pattern for our workplace and the community, we set a good pattern for that individual relationship. So that we know that we can say to the other person, you hurt me, and they will say, I'm so sorry. Or they can say to you, you offended me, and we can say, I'm so sorry. How can I make that right? That's how we de-escalate. That's how we bring it down to a sane level where we can make amends, where we can work together, where we can move forward. What would it look like to build a culture of good apologies in our church and in our families and in our workplaces? What would that look like? So once we've apologized, then there's this whole thing of offering forgiveness. How do we do that well? How do we offer forgiveness to someone else? It's hard for us to apologize and admit we're wrong, but sometimes it's hard for us to let go of the hurts of the past. Sometimes that hurt was this morning. Sometimes that hurt was this week. Sometimes that hurt was 20 years ago. But boy, we're hanging on to it. But When was the last time someone offended you personally? How long did it take you to forgive? Or have you forgiven? We live in a world with people who are far from perfect, people who make mistakes, people who make choices that can hurt us deeply. And so I know that if we went around the room, every one of us can talk about how we've been on the wrong end of a painful situation. Some things are easy to forgive. Some things we have no trouble getting over, right? If someone bumps into you in the grocery store in line and they go, "Oh, sorry," we're not like, "No, now I'm going to hate you forever." That's easy to get over, right? It's a small thing. It's not something we carry with us for weeks. If everything else in your life is going well, forgiveness comes easily, even sometimes for bigger things. But if you're having a hard time in your life and someone does something to hurt or offend you, even small things can become an obstacle. Do you know that Stanford University has a whole project dedicated to forgiveness and helping people forgive? I know this just blew my mind at all of the forgiveness research that's out there. Stanford University has the Stanford Forgiveness Project, and their whole goal is to help people forgive and move on with their lives. They say that it takes people about 6 weeks to really forgive. Over 50% of the people that they were working with saw results after 6 weeks of doing these things. And some of these people had a lot to forgive. They did this in groups of people from Northern Ireland. I'm going to talk about people who have a lot to forgive. They did this in forgiving related to the 9/11 terror attacks. So when they say that people saw a difference in their ability to forgive, that's a big deal. So they said, when you go to forgive, here are the things that you need to keep in mind. Here are their steps to forgiveness, if you will. They said the first thing to do is to define the offense clearly, to be able to say why it is you're upset, to name it. Name why you're upset, and then talk about it with a trusted friend. For us as Christians, we can name that offense, and we can either talk about it to a trusted friend, but did you know that you can just do this in prayer? I have one friend I trust more than any other. And trust me, he's not telling anybody. We can go to God and say, God, I was hurt by this very specific thing. It hurt me. The next step is to make a commitment to forgive. Okay, so you've got an offense. You've got to decide that you want to forgive. And sometimes that's a decision that we have to make. Sometimes we can forgive easily without a thought, but sometimes we have to make a conscious choice in our will to forgive. And they said it's important to make a commitment to forgive even if the other person never apologizes, and even if you are never able to confront them. So this works even if the person you need to forgive has already died. This works even if the person you need to forgive moved halfway around the world and you'll never see them again. This works even if the person you need to forgive is a dangerous person and you should not have contact with them. You make a choice, a commitment to forgive. Their third thing is to define forgiveness. Forgiveness does not mean that you never think of it again. Forgiveness does not mean that what they did was not wrong. Forgiveness does not mean that they say, I'm sorry. Forgiveness means that you and I are free, that you and I have peace of mind. Not that we excuse the other person's behavior, but we set aside the act of blaming as unhelpful. And we begin to change our story. That last part is really important because the fourth thing that they say is that we need to recognize that the cause of our pain is really our own thoughts and the story that we tell ourselves about what happened. I can guarantee you that if that person that bumped into you in the grocery store, if you would have spent the next 15 minutes telling yourself that that person bumped into you on purpose, that they did it because they hated you, and that they really inflicted harm on you, that small offense could be something that did stick with you for years. Because the story we tell ourselves about our pain is the story that we believe. And that is what perpetuates the pain over and over and over again. In our worship in the Word this morning, we saw this very thing happen. Joseph and his brothers feared for their lives. And I think rightfully so, okay? They sold their brother into slavery, told their father he was dead, and went on with their lives like nothing happened. Okay, that's kind of a big thing to forgive. Their family reconciles, but in their minds, these brothers are telling themselves, Joseph only reconciled with our family because our father is still alive. And so when their father dies, they say, oh my goodness, he's going to bring the wrath on us. And so they send him a message and they say, remember our father. He said for us to say to you that we're really, really sorry and that you need to forgive us. And it broke Joseph's heart because Joseph had already rewritten the story. Do you know that Joseph could have every day for all of those years told himself, my brothers hate me. My brothers hate me. They sold me into slavery and I can never forgive that. It's too great of a wound. But instead, when they say to him, forgive us, he says, I can't stand in the place of God. Joseph is telling himself a different story. I can't stand in the place of God. Yes, what you did was wrong. He didn't say, oh, no big deal. He said, what you did was wrong and you meant it for evil, but guess what? God used it for good. Not just for you, not just for me, but to save thousands of people. God used it for good. Joseph rewrote the story that he told himself about his journey into slavery, into Egypt, and up through the ranks. He rewrote the story. Oftentimes, the cause of our pain, especially years later, has to do with the story we tell ourselves about what happened. The initial hurt was the responsibility of the person who hurt us, but all of that hurt since is something that we have held on to. Sometimes for dear life, as though it's a life preserver, when in reality, it just hurts us again and again. We need to let go. We need to let go. That's their fifth step. Let go of a desire to control and know that other people cannot meet your needs. If I do something to hurt you and offend you, I can't go back in time and take that back. I don't have a magic wand to wave over that wound and make it disappear. I can't make it not happen. And neither can anyone else who has ever hurt us. They can't take it back. We can find ways to move forward together, but there is no erasing the past. Other people cannot meet your needs. And sometimes we say, well, if they just apologized, well, okay. And then they apologize. Well, if they just did this, okay. We can come up with an endless list of reasons not to forgive. We need to let go of our desire to control and recognize that other people are not able to meet all of our needs. The sixth and final thing they said is put your energy into finding other ways of fulfilling the needs you have and go on and live a good life. The best revenge is not allowing that hurt to ruin the rest of your life. Offering forgiveness, either to someone that we're in relationship with every day or someone who hurt us in the distant past. Sometimes that's so hard to do. But it's necessary if we're going to walk in freedom. Sometimes it's not enough just to say you're forgiven, especially if you did it like I did when I was a kid. You're forgiven. Sometimes it's not enough. Sometimes we have to forgive every day. Sometimes we have to forgive every hour. Sometimes more often than that. It helps us to walk through steps like this so that we can reframe our way of thinking. And then when we forgive, we know it doesn't just set that other person free. It sets us free to live the lives that God has called us to. Lives God has called us to as what? Dearly loved children. It all comes back to that, doesn't it? You and I are not unloved. You and I are not unchosen. You and I are not at the bottom of the heap. Did you know that you're God's favorite? And you being God's favorite doesn't take away from the fact that the person sitting next to you is also God's favorite. God chose you. God loves you. And when it seems that the world does not choose you, when it seems that the world does not love you, you can turn to God and say, God, I am desperately in pain from rejection. And God is there to fill that empty hole. God is there to pour grace and mercy on the wounds of our past. Sometimes we have to take it to God and trust that God is the just judge. And like Joseph, say, I can't put myself in the place of God to stand over you in judgment. I find it really interesting, fascinating really, that all of these studies are pointing back to something that we hold in our hands that the world so desperately needs. Something that we find in the Bible, something that we find in the teachings of Jesus. It's amazing to me that the UN recognizes the need for forgiveness and reconciliation in order to have a more peaceful world. So what would it look like if you and I took forgiveness and made it a priority? What would it look like in our families? What would it look like in our marriages? What would it look like in our workplaces, in our community? Maybe it would look like getting in a car accident and forgiving the person who ran into you and advocating on their behalf and loving them and caring about what happened to them. Boy, if we did that, the world just wouldn't know what to do. Who does that? We do. Because we're followers of Jesus. What would it look like if the church around the world practiced forgiveness and grace? Forgiveness and grace in their communities. What would happen? Imagine with me the hope and the renewal that we could experience if forgiveness wasn't just a topic of study in a lab somewhere. Imagine with me the hope and renewal if you and I made forgiveness one of the markers of discipleship to Jesus Christ. How amazing would that be? Think of the doors that would open to the message of Christ, to the gospel. I hope we'll take it, and I hope we'll take it seriously.